this is like someone who is on LSD or knows about its effects, but of course he's written the Red Book, he's involved in active imagination. I mean, when I read this, it's like a poem. I should hate the thought that I have touched on the spear where the paint is made that colours the world. If ever I took LSD, I touched the paint that colours the world, where the light is created that shines the splendour of the dawn, the lines and shapes of all form that fills the orbit, the thought that illuminates the darkness of the void. I am profoundly mistrustful of the pure gifts of the gods. You pay dearly for them. I have to be very respectful of his view when I read that. But I have to know of many of the clients and people I know of who have died in their 40s and early 50s because they never admitted, for example, they had a problem with alcohol, or if they did, they could cope with it on their own. And so my balance is, why not try? Why not try it? But that's a personal viewpoint I'm giving you now. So this to me is pure poetry. And it is definitely someone who's been there, I think. So in 1957, Betty Grosvenor Iser, a clinical psychologist, wrote to Jung. She'd been present at the session in Los Angeles where Bill took his first LSD trip in the Veterans Hospital in LSD along with Dr. Sidney Cohen. In her letter, she stated for her that LSD was almost a religious drug. So Jung replied, she said it's a religious drug for her. Mrs. Eisner, I don't feel happy about these things, since you merely fall into such experiences without being able to integrate them. To have so-called religious visions of this kind has more to do with physiology, but nothing with religion. Religion is a way of life and a devotion and submission to certain superior facts, a state of mind which cannot be injected by a syringe or swallowed in the form of a pill. Ooh, that would be hurtful. That would be hurtful. Comparing LSD to heroin or amphetamine, it is to my mind a helpful method to the barbarous peyote. Wow, barbaric. But a regrettable regression for a cultivated individual, a dangerously simple ersatz and substitute for a true religion. I mean, they say Jung had a temperament that he would shout at his secretary. This to me is like, I would forgive the man anything, including this, but it's very bitter to me, and you can contradict me on it, and that's fine. So he calls it barbaric, peyote. Unfortunately, we have in the Jung Institute someone who did their thesis on LSD, and I will show you his comments in relation to Jung's words. So John Laney, he considered Jung's stance to be totally without substance. Laney claimed that because the smoking of peyote is centered in a 12-hour ceremony called a prayer meeting, it's similar to Catholic High Mass, and Jung had therefore vilified prayer itself. It's almost like when you talk to some people about ayahuasca in Brazil, it's a religious experience for them. I'm not advocating it, by the way. I gave a lecture in Rome last month and someone wrote to me saying, do you sell LSD? I was thinking of writing back and saying, how else do you think I make my living? But I was thinking, no, NSA are into everybody's computers nowadays. I better not be too cheeky. So, a scientific approach would soon have discovered that these people do not use mescaline, syringes, or pills. It would have found them to be deeply religious, in no way barbarous, not seeking of shortcuts. Rather, it would have found a pan-Indian religious development of at least a century's duration. So he's highly critical of Jung. And well, that's the nice thing about Jungianism, I would like to think, as opposed to Freudianism or Lacanianism, where people who were outside of the group, who criticized it, became outsiders and were excluded, but Jungianism, I hope, would be more democratic to allow a criticism such as this. And I'm not saying that Jung was wrong on this. I'm saying the jury should still be out on it, and more investigation should be done on it. And that now comes to, I'll refer to that towards the end, I think in about 5 to 10 more minutes. So in the mid-50s, Bill Wilson was distanced from the running of AA, probably related to his views on what we call outside matters. In particular, his own use of LSD and his promotion of LSD as a means to help alcoholics who were having difficulty accepting the spiritual side of the program. So in 1955 or 56, he stepped down from the leadership of AA. And he was distant from the trustees. They didn't want to be associated, anything to do with LSD, because they don't get involved in controversial matters. And at this stage, LSD was beginning to be controversial. So now Bill writes to Carl Jung, not knowing of Jung's antagonism towards the psychedelic drugs. The third page of the letter, I've already given you a lot of it, so I was just saying that really that, so he has written this to you, but I won't dwell on it too much because time is coming close. But he's saying there is a development now going on in the area of spiritual, mystical experience which were triggered by the use of LSD. A rare Mexican mushroom and with the peyote cactus button of America's western plains. Now he's referring to peyote. As perhaps you know, many psychiatrists still cling to the conviction that these LSD experiencers are always schizophrenia, should be schizophrenic, but whoever, and rather dangerous. Jung hasn't quite said that. Yet hard evidence has been accumulating that this is seldom the case. Lysergic acid, LSD, is very truly harmless and quite non-addictive. Now this is the third page of the letter. Would I show this to clients who are coming in for the first time to me, show and say, look, you should be taking LSD? I go, no way. Not at all. Wouldn't even tell them about it. Would I like them to know about it? That was a thought that had to enter me when I was writing my book. Should I include this letter? And I came down in favour of doing so, but to put it in the appendix rather than to highlight it in my book, simply because I didn't want to advertise that this was about LSD. It would be for true seekers, and I felt because I had the Jungian balance that I permitted myself, talking to other people as well, that there could be a dialogue rather than the Sun newspaper getting hold of it and say, founder of AA promotes drug LSD. So anyway, this was the first paragraph. Now in the rest of the letter he's talking about seances and how you can measure the psychic energy and wonderful information, but this, because both of them were into seances, and when I read the material, they're asking information about the war and who's going to win the war and what about this battle, and I took some notes and compared them to the military battles that were happening and the conclusions that we're getting from them. They were off the wall, actually. They weren't getting the correct answers from the mediums. But he was a medium, a bit like Jung. Again, the connection. So now we have the second part of it. Some of my AA friends and I have taken the material frequently and with much benefit. Once in the experience, there's a great broadening and deepening and heightening of consciousness which bears little or no relation to hallucination. More reality is seen and felt, not less. We have seen the whole range of valid spiritual experience precipitated in this matter. On my first trial several years ago, my original spontaneous spiritual experience of 25 years before was reenacted in a wonderful splendor and conviction. This is the spiritual experience he experienced in the hospital, in Torrance Hospital. Now, how it came about that Dr. Osmond, gave alcoholics LSD was this. He was giving LSD to schizophrenics to see if it would help them. And they were having the equivalent of delirium tremens. So he thought, Abraham and Hoffer thought, let's give it to alcoholics as a warning to induce delirium tremens. But in fact, the alcoholics loved it. Wow, these great experiences, we're connecting. And it's as though, as somebody pointed out to me last month, it's as though the alcoholics had this openness for this spiritual experience already. It was there. So, thank you for bearing with me. This is quite long. And okay, thank you. So because of a close contact with the two physicians, Hoffer and Osmond, the University of, that's the word I can't pronounce. Saskatchewan. I'm going to go to one of these voice trainers and learn how to pronounce that someday.
Saskatchewan.
So I've access to case material covering thousands of administrations there and worldwide. These friends, each of them a psychiatrist and biochemist, were no doubt the first positions to see a spiritual significance in LSD. Their very large experience has made it impossible for them to deny the objective reality of most of these experiences they have seen and indeed that they have had themselves. My friends have many alcoholics in their charge at the provincial mental hospital. As well know, these would be extremely difficult cases, even after excluding marked psychotics. AA gets about a 5% recovery in such cases. Now he's talking about difficult cases. The recovery rate may be closer to 10 to 20%. But if these alcoholics are first preconditioned by LSD and then placed in the surrounding AA groups, the result is startling. Over the past 3 years, 150 cases have been so treated by my Canadian friends. As of this writing, 75 are remaining perfectly sober in the outside world. This scarcely squares with the widespread view that LSD is dangerous and hallucinatory. So he's telling Jung, here's the statistics. Now, he may have buttered them up a bit, but he's trying to convince Jung, so he wants an affirmative answer from Jung. Now, can you imagine, would Jung risk saying, having been criticized for so many things by the established professions, do you think he'd risk endorsing LSD? I don't think so, but it's only my view based on what he has written. But what I'm saying is that if he changed his mind on groups, or if he did ever change his mind on groups, would he be flexible enough? So again, the letter continues, my friends believe that LSD temporarily triggers a change in blood chemistry that inhibits or reduces ego, thereby enabling more reality to be felt and seen. The amount of LSD needed is extremely small, and the material seems to be eliminated from the body before the experience begins. Little effect is noted in the first hour, but the experience continues for many hours. It may be, chemically speaking, that the predisposing effect of LSD bears some relation to what may be chemically occur in aesthetic practices such as fasting, yoga, exercise, and the like. In other words, he's really talking about, in a way, inducing it, perhaps through active imagination, but these are skills that have to be learned. Of course, these LSD manifestations are deeply shocking to many theologians and even psychiatrists, yet a total of 50,000 administrations in the US and Canada during the past 7 or 8 years have resulted in virtually no harm and large benefits. He's not a statistician, so I would be a bit iffy on his statistics. I've entered these observations for your interest and if agreeable for your comment, but please do be assured that it would be perfectly understood if time, inclination or health should not permit you to reply. Mainly I'm writing in thanks for your recent message and again to record the deep gratitude of our AA fellowship for your single contribution to its welfare over the years. He considered Carl Jung to be one of the founding members of AA. Lilia Yaffe writes, Carl Jung read your letter of March 20th. This is in May. So he hasn't replied instantly to it. He had in his mind to answer you, but that he fell ill and the doctor ordered complete rest. Feeling better, he left for a long vacation and therefore the mail is not come. Maybe he will write you at a later time. Lilia Yaffe added, also, he said he was very much interested in the work of Alcoholics Anonymous. Jung died in June 1961. Let's just look at that again. May the 5th, Now, what I can tell you is that the last letter Carl Jung wrote that's in the selected letters was dated March the 10th. So he had not written a letter that was published, that I'm aware of, since March the 10th, and it was 2 months after Bill Wilson had written to him. I would say not a man to avoid a sticky question, but he didn't answer. According to Yaffe, it was ill health that prevented the 86-year-old Jung from replying to Wilson's letter. This was probably not an excuse, given that the last recorded letter in C.G. Jung Letters, volume 51-61, was dated March 10, 1961. That is 10 days before Wilson wrote his second letter to Jung. So is the use of LSD, you'll be glad to hear this is the last couple of slides now. Is the use of LSD to induce a spiritual experience in alcoholic, is it deserving of further research? September 2014, the British Psychologist Society magazine was devoted to psychedelic drugs. Professor David Nutt, the principal contributor, he was the czar of drugs. I don't know if you know of him. He was the appointed czar of drugs. But the Sun newspaper got his name and said, you know, the nutty professor advocates decriminalizing marijuana, etc. I met him in Scarborough 2 months ago, and he's still trying to get permission to get a license to use LSD on some experiments. Hence, to get a license to use it with people who are, as far as I know, dying, not from alcoholism, but just dying, and they want to see if they can get a spiritual connection. It's work that's been done in Washington, D.C., where they have permitted this license. And David Nutt is trying to get a license, but it takes 3 years to get the license. So he said the failure of the scientific community, particularly neuroscientists, which he is, to protest the denial of research on hallucinogens is one of the most disturbing failures of science leadership in the past century, and it must be rectified. So thank you so much for your attention.
Now, at this point, we usually just rearrange ourselves and have a